Hello and welcome to Valley of the Sun, which is actually holding its end of the bargain right now, although those rain clouds over there do look pretty ominous. After a changeable track in Leergang, where it was raining heavily overnight, there really isn't being any let off here in Italy, and honestly, the rain that was coming down last night was pretty treacherous. This week, I wanted to think about the big brake rotors that a lot of teams are running, as well as talk about some tyre tech and the choice that is so difficult on a track like this, where it is not only very steep and hard to brake, but also there is one or two routes that might just catch you out and be a bit slippy. We also caught up with Norco's Kirk McDowell to talk about his role within the team and developing that new downhill bike, which they've been at for a little while now. We hope you enjoy it. So here we have two tyres from Kenda, both with prototype written on the side. However, this one looks to be a Hellcat. Maybe it's got some different casing in there or different compound. And so far, the unnamed model that we've been seeing cropping up at some races. So to look at them, they look and are very similar, but there are some key differences. And the application in which they're used is going to be a bit different. So first of all, well, let's talk about this new tyre actually. So it's very Assegai-esque, I think it's safe to say. It's got that really familiar sort of alternating tread pattern going 3-2, 3-2 in the centre, as well as having sort of essentially uniform lugs on the side, compared to what I presume to be the Hellcat, which has a similar pattern in that it's got those three central knobs, but then it goes three, a close two, then a wide two. And what that's going to do is a small but subtle difference, and that's going to be how it sheds mud. So when you're really pressing the tyre into the soft mud, as you can imagine, it wants to sort of escape and purge around the tread. A more open tread pattern will allow it to do that to greater effect. Also, it goes away from having a universal side knob to this L-shaped one, which is a small but subtle difference. Lastly, the stack height of the lugs is higher on this Hellcat. Now, that is a small but subtle difference, but basically this is going to be better at sort of digging into soft mud. But the problem with long knobs is that, if you'll excuse the pun, is that they tend to distort more under high load. I'm in tricky territory here, so I'm going to try and use some clean language. However, shorter ones will basically, when driven into hard compressions, will hold up better. And, I think that's about all I can say. So we are here at the pivot pits, and behind me we have the bike of Dane Jewett, who is the current overall leader in the junior category. And if you look at that rear end, it is now doing without the CNC lugged setup that you'd have seen previously on the pivots. Now, in some ways, it's not so different. I imagine they'll be using a CNC machine to make the molds for that carbon. However, they'll need to make one CNC lug then instead of many, because it is horrifically expensive. I've heard some of these CNC lugged frame used by Pivot, but also maybe the Specialized guys, it's like 20, 25K US. I mean, it is a huge amount of money. So instead, you just make one mold and then you can have many, many frames out of it. However, in some ways, they're reliant upon the same technology to reap the benefits of a CNC'd frame. And what that is basically, it's incredibly precise and the tolerances are very small compared to a welded alloy frame, which has to deal with heat and bending, etc., etc. Interestingly enough, I imagine they'll be going to like a modular system where they'll be kind of replacing it bit by bit until eventually you have the full carbon production bike. That rear end also looks to use the same flex pivot to make that 6-bar possible, and looks really cool, and it will be a heck of a lot more affordable. So we're here at the Gamux pits. Now, you had a big weekend last weekend with that podium in the junior category. It felt like it was a long time coming.
Yeah, sure. Like we know the boys have the speed, so it was really good to see finally Mike putting everything together.
Now I want to talk a bit about this kind of pinion gearbox setup that you have, which also has a belt drive. The race in Leergang was very wet, or at least it was sort of changeable conditions, but there was a lot of rainfall. Yeah. Here looks to be similar. With these, it's when you see a standard bicycle chain, it's really obvious how the mud can purge through the chain if it needs to. What's it like running these systems in the wet, changeable, dirty conditions? And do you ever have any issues?
No, it's pretty much a similar thing like with a chain drive system. So if you don't wash it, you're gonna fuck up eventually. Sorry for my English.
That's all right.
But if you take care of your drivetrain and when it's really sticky, like last weekend, wash the drivetrain every run, is fine, honestly. The mud can shed pretty well through these cavities here. So the belt will actually push the mud through, since there's quite a bit of tension, as you can see here on the tensioner. There's quite a bit of load going, or the tension through the belt, so it actually is never a real big issue. As long as you keep cleaning it, you're fine.
And, you know, belt drives often have claims of quite extreme longevity.
Yeah.
Do you run the same, you know, we see some teams changing a chain sort of every race weekend. Do you run this for half a season, a whole season? How long do you get out of a belt?
So we do have a race belt and a practice belt, and the practice belt runs everything from half a year to a year, and then the race belts is just there to be really sure that everything is perfect and stuff. So we change those every weekend, but it's not due to the fact that they are broken or anything. It's just for whatever. You try to get the best out of the system and make sure everything is perfect. So we change those for racing, but practice belts, as I said, half a season, easy.
And we've also seen a lot of teams now running with like basically a weight ballast on the down tube to try and basically preload the chassis a bit more, get a bit better tracking when it gets really rough and choppy. Obviously with the gearbox, is that something you're exploring? Do you ever add additional weight, or is the gearbox about enough?
No, because we're basically moving like 600 to 800 grams from the rear wheel to the middle of the bike. We actually already have that better distribution of sprung versus unsprung weight. So for us, everything we do with the bike is mostly centered around the sprung weight distribution. And the gearbox is like the perfect helper with that kind of thing, because everything is down low, down center. So we actually see in telemetry that the rear wheel is quite a bit more active on the same bike with a gearbox or a conventional drivetrain. And we've also worked with gates and pinion quite heavily to also understand the differences, because it does affect the suspension as well. So yeah, I think gearboxes are here to stay, and specifically with electrical shifting and all these kind of tuning and mapping you can do with these kind of things, it's already quite competitive. And I think there's the fact that other teams put weight to their down tubes actually proves our point. So it's also quite satisfying to see this, to be honest.
I bet. And one last question. You mentioned the electric shifting there. They have basically a sensor in there to stop, because at least the ones I've ridden have a sensor because they want the sort of shifting to be done at that point, which is basically the less sort of torque that's going through the system. Is there any sort of race tune you do to make it maybe less sympathetic towards the gearbox, but better for racing? Because when I'm cruising around the woods, it doesn't actually matter how fast I shift really. Yeah. But when you're smashing, you know, trying to get to the race line as quick as possible, I imagine it does matter. Is that something that you have the option of?
I can't confirm or not confirm, but you can guess yourselves. It's an electronic system, so you can sort of...
There is a bit of potential room for error. Not room for error, sorry, room for tweaking would be a better phrase.
We're always working on improvements and understanding pedaling characteristics and when and where to shift, under load, no load, what's actually beneficial. And together with Pinion, we do quite a bit of research in these things, and I know we're always improving, and marginal gains. Basically every race we improve a little bit with these kind of things. So eventually there will be stuff coming to market which is probably able to shift under load fully, and yeah, there's stuff coming, but as I said, I can't confirm or deny anything at this point.
But that's also what the race team's for. It is to torture test equipment in a way. So actually it's probably quite valuable if you were able to sort of finesse that system a bit. It's only going to give more valuable data in the long run, I suppose.
Exactly, 100%.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for your time. So we're here with Anxo in the frameworks bits, and I'd love to talk a bit about sort of tyre selection for what is going to be a really technical track, lots of rocks, lots of roots, but also maybe a wet race this weekend. Does it ever get wet enough in a place like this to go to a full spike, which I guess would be the hydro?
Yeah, we have the hydro tail, but we never really went for it. Like the spikes are really long and they felt it a little bit unpredictable. And the Argo is working really well when it's like muddy and soft. And also the crypto front is working really well on mud conditions too. We found out last weekend in Leogang. So we're really good on Contis.
Do you ever run the more open tread pattern of the Cryptotile rear, which is like a DHR2 style, on the front just to help?
No, they don't really like it on the front. Like they found it a little bit like unpredictable when you go like from center to leaning. So we use it at the back pretty much when it's like softer, and when we have like deep ruts, we found like the rear cut better into the ruts. But last weekend we didn't have like that those deep ruts into Leogen, so we stick into the front or Argo, depends on the softer conditions.
I remember maybe I suppose when the Shorty came out from Access, so that was sort of a production cut spike. And now it feels like with tyres like the Argotile, they're like a production cut Shorty almost. A bit more versatile, better in the dry perhaps.
Yeah. Also, I think the modern bikes has way more traction because of the wheel diameter and stuff. So you don't need to really put too much, like all the effort into the tires. So the big contact patch of the bigger wheels are helping a lot with that. So I think now the Argos are like really good into that, and the rolling speed is so good too. It didn't feel too much like less rolling speed like in the past with the other matte tires. So yeah.
And what, obviously you've got a couple of different riders racing. Typically, what pressures would you say, what's a baseline pressure for them?
Try to stick in the same pressures pretty much, maybe 1 or 2 psi lower, but we really like think like the tread path is like the one who has to do that, not the pressure, pretty much.
And what pressures would that be roughly?
Like PSI, like 24, 25 front, 23 depends, and 28, 29 at the rear.
I noticed you're running those sort of quite shallow envy rims with the rim strip. Do you ever run inserts?
No, we don't run inserts because they have a rim strip, so it holds the tire even if we have a small crack into the rim, and they recommend don't use inserts. And also with the contest, the casing is really good, so we found that like the support is better coming from the air, not from the rims, like the inserts.
I remember it would have been a couple of years ago, and we spoke a bit about, it's just like a passing conversation, but you mentioned about sort of the life expectancy of a tyre, not so much through the tread pattern, but it's in its ability to resist compression forces because these riders ride so tough.
You can see like after like 3-4 laps, because of the pressure they put into the tires, like you can see how the treads are marked, and you don't want to take the risk to still using that tire. Like you can see the knobs really well, but the casing can be really stressed because of all the stress they're putting onto the tires.
And do you think that could ever lead to a higher chance of like rim failure or anything like that?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I'm trying to keep like tires not more than 5 laps. Like 4 is the maximum that I think to be safe into the safe spot. I think it's the best.
Which is super funny because I think, yeah, when you have downhill tyres, if you have one that actually you get a long time out of, by the end, you can put on a new tyre and it just feels actually so much more stiffer.
Yeah. I mean, like we found out with Angel, for example, when he used to ride the same tires like 2 or 3 days training, when he went into the fresh tires, he felt like an extra suspension pretty much.
So we're here at the Norco pits with Kirk. Now, Kirk, you raced World Cups sort of off your own bat. I think you had a Da Vinci setup for a while.
Yeah.
Can you just explain what your role is in this Norco setup and what the structure is?
Yeah, so my official role at Norco itself is a development engineer. So I work with the kind of R&D side of our engineering team. And then over the past couple of years, we've been developing this new downhill bike. So yeah, I've been lucky enough to kind of go racing on that thing. And yeah, a big part of my role, I guess, has been developing the downhill bike.
And so when you're kind of at the races collecting the data, is that to sort of inform Norco of like the long-term design route? Or is it to do more immediate stuff with the other riders here at the race venue?
I'd say it's a bit of both. Like, I think we're collecting data to learn and have the opportunity to do it on these like World Cup tracks, which we don't have access to at home necessarily. So kind of like learning over the long term, what sort of data we need to collect and trends and stuff. But then also definitely using it to drive setup and looking in the data for certain metrics that we know work well and trying to strive to hit those at new tracks.
And how valuable do you think it's been for the development of this bike, having sort of one of the design team? I mean, across the industry, people are really passionate and they love riding, but there's a huge difference to how like an enthusiast like me rides a bike compared to someone like you who actually races at an elite level. How valuable do you think that's been to Norco?
Yeah, I like to think that it's been very valuable because it's just a different kind of, I don't know, a different sport almost from the local home races to a World Cup, and then even to what these top guys are doing at a World Cup compared to what I'm doing. There's difference there. But
so when we think about how useful your work is to a brand like Norco, Because there's a real big difference between, how there are passionate enthusiasts right across the industry, but compared to someone like me who has a keen interest in bike design, but just loves riding bikes, we ride bikes in a massively different way to someone like you who loves bikes, but also rides at an elite level. How useful do you think your feedback is to the design process?
Well, having ridden with you at the bike park, actually, I know that you're not a slouch on the downhill bike, but
I knew that run pretty well, to be fair.
but yeah, I mean, no, it's kind of, I don't know, the closer you get to the pointy end of the sport and on these like World Cup tracks, it's just different to what we have at the local race series. So I think it's been really valuable to, over the course of developing the bike, we've been racing it along the way. And I think, without that, you can't really kind of prepare for a World Cup without just going to race the thing,
And do you think, one final question, do you think there'll ever be a time where, as an industry, we really, in skiing, for instance, it's not expected if I'm going up to ride my local resort on the weekend, I'm not doing it on a set of World Cup skis. There's a real acknowledgement that the needs for the different levels are different in terms of compliance, in terms of feel. Can you ever see a world where brands start to really say, like, hey, this is the great race bike, but actually for your enthusiast, maybe having something a bit friendlier or, a bit more compliant is the way forward?
Yeah, I think that's been a really cool thing about this project is kind of from the top down, the ask of us has just been to develop the fastest race bike with no, no regard really for a production bike. And I think it's going to make a good production bike in the end.
For instance, a good example would be, I rode Nico Mullally's Frameworks bike, and I found it a bit too stiff, almost kind of not harsh, but getting there. But obviously, he was saying that for him, because he just pushes it so much harder, it actually brings it into its sort of operating window in a way that I never could. Conversely, he rode that steel bike in Leogang like last weekend, and afterwards he came up and he said, that steel's probably a bit more for you, because when he was going, suddenly it was kind of getting distorted in a way that I could never do.
Yeah, from the frame flex perspective, I think we're learning a lot about that. Actually, it's really interesting and kind of seeing like what we've done with Greg's bike with the carbon overlaid back end to get a little more stiffness out of it. I think we are learning that like once you really start to push the bike, you kind of do need a bit more stiffness and it may not necessarily be comfortable at a kind of slower pace. But we thankfully have a lot of rigs to test that back at Norco. So we're kind of getting a library of all these frame flex numbers that starting to learn what works good and what might not. And I think another cool way how this project's going to feed into production bikes.
Amazing, thanks, man, and best of luck on the racetrack this weekend. So we're here in the Goodman Santa Cruz pits with Thibault Laly, one-time Pinkbike Racing alumni, always a Pinkbike Racing alumni, and now you're both racer and team manager for this setup. And I want to talk about these huge rotors that you've got on front and back, which are 220, 223?
223, yeah.
Now, sometimes I suppose, the bigger the rotor, the longer the braking track is per revolution, right?
Yeah.
But they can also get quite bitey. They can get quite grabby.
Yeah.
What's the sensation riding 220s front and rear? And is that something that ever is a bit too powerful, perhaps?
Yeah, so riding this rotor, especially because it's still cold, because it's of course bigger, and it gets more bitey. So riding XT brakes, not XTR or Saint, just because it's a choice of feeling, with the sensations of the riders. Plus, those big rotors are really, really cool because they don't bend. They're really strong. So what the feeling is that, it's very bitey because it's big. So the pad can have a big contact with the rotor. And especially, it's still cold, for top to bottom.
And so are you going for mainly power, or are you is it more about controlling the heat?
More for power in general. It's mainly for power, for sure.
And if you were to race, in this track, hopefully the sun's out now, it's going to be dry this weekend, but when you have tracks that are maybe lots of rocks, lots of roots, and not much grip, is there ever any advantage, do you think, to go into a smaller rotor for maybe a bit more feel?
It's a good question. I think on a long track like this, it's good to have power for sure, but especially on the cooler aspect, it's better for long tracks for sure. I don't really know which one is better. I think we just set the bikes like this, and it's a good fitting with the riders. Yeah, I'm not sure which one of those two aspects we prioritize, but in general, having like a strong and good like braking bit is it's a good feeling for the riders, and if they feel confident just at any braking points, then it's what matters, I think.
One last question as well regarding Galfa. I assume you're running their pads as well.
Yeah.
Galfa make a lot of different compounds, actually for some different brands within the industry as well. Do you tend to go for a softer pad with more bite or something? They do that purple pad, the e-bike one, which is actually really good at managing heat. What will you be running this weekend?
So we're running green pads. It's very soft. Of course, we change them a lot, but we know it's like as soon as you touch the brake, boom. It's like beating hard the rotor, and you're sure you're gonna brake hard. So yeah, we prioritize good braking, and yeah, it's not very ecological or longevity, but we don't really care about this here. It's racing, and you know what it's like.
Amazing, thanks, man.
Thank you.